Buhler, the director of the Madison Coalition, working to restore a balance of state and federal power. I just want to say, and he'll get into this more, but when you have a government overreach at the federal level, what becomes front and center is federalism, the sovereignty of states. But as our brother's going to bring it up to our attention, I believe, listen closely, and he'll emphasize this heavily, but I want to touch it before and after. I think all of us are aware of what a precarious position our nation is in, and this is the most, we always say this, but this is the most important election cycle in my lifetime. I believe we are so close to a complete socialist takeover that I believe if another Democrat gets another 4 years in the White House, regardless of who it is, the control mechanisms in the deep state and the three-letter agencies, I believe America will be in peril. I believe that. But the second most, after this election, the second most issue in front of us is the potential of the left packing the Supreme Court. That, to me, is the second most important issue in front of us. This election cycle and getting this corrected. Romans served for 14 years as the senior lawyer on election integrity issues for Republicans in the House of Representatives. He was originally hired by Newt Gingrich to be the first House counsel. And he's working now on a major project that he's going to be sharing with us this morning, a proposal called KeepNine making an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. He's now back, this emphasis is now backed by more than 200 members of Congress and a total of more than 1,000 elected officials nationwide. It's an honor for us to have him with us this morning. Put your hands together for Roman Buhler.
I am here because I believe, just as Jesse suggested, that we are on the verge of a disaster for the American Republic experiment. Those of you who study history know that democracy has been tried a number of times in world history. It failed in Greece. It failed again in Rome. We, America, are the third great experiment. And, you know, there's a difference in philosophy, I think, between those who believe that man is supreme and those who believe that there is a higher power. And we have in this country a left that believe that man can somehow perfectly rule over others. And so they don't believe in checks and balances on the abuse of power. They believe in absolute power. And the great battle we have been fighting, and I don't think it has been noticed, is not the battle between the left and the right. That's what you get all the media. But it's the battle between those who believe in absolute power for the rulers and those who believe that there is a higher power and there needs to be a limit on the power of man. And when you look at the strategy of the left today, and I know, let me take a minute. Lady standing right here, put you on the spot. What is the issue that you care about the most? The single issue you care about the most? Immigration. The gentleman right here in the t-shirt, in the palm t-shirt, what is the issue you care about the most? Abortion. The gentleman in the back there with the glasses and the dark suit like mine, what is the issue you care about the most? That's you. You're looking around and no, you're the spotlight's on you. Okay. So here we have people who care about a number of issues. But those issues are the tentacles of the octopus. Immigration, election integrity, abortion, religious freedom, the left's effort to crush the fossil fuel industry, their goal of ruling by regulation rather than laws passed by Congress, Second Amendment rights, all of these are tentacles, they're policy. But I want to ask a question I ask sometimes of the students I work with. If you had 3 wishes, what is your first wish? What should be your first wish always? Anybody want to try a guess for that question? So my answer is more wishes. More wishes. And when you look at what the left does with power, what's the first thing they do with power? It's to get more power. So their plan, pack the Supreme Court, get rid of the Electoral College, get rid of the Senate filibuster, all of which give them more power and destroy checks and balances on the abuse of power. Now I want to step back and tell you just my story. I was a grassroots activist in California. I went to a guy who was running for governor right after Ronald Reagan. He was going to be Ronald Reagan's successor. And I said, I'll give you all my free time for a year. And they said, you want a job? And I said, well, if you got a job, that's great. But you don't have to hire me. I'll do it. And they ended up hiring me. And so at 23, I ended up being the speechwriter for the guy who would have been Ronald Reagan's successor. It was amazing, only a higher power could have made it happen. Well, we lost by 1% of the vote, but that got me started in politics. And so my thought in those days was, gee, if we just elect a Republican majority in Washington, take back control, we can solve all these problems. So I spent 20 years in California doing grassroots work, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I get this phone call from Washington, and it's Newt Gingrich's office, and they want to hire me as their lead counsel on election integrity issues, apparently because I made a lot of enemies and I wasn't afraid of, pissing people off. And so anyway, I go back to Washington, and I'm the lead Republican lawyer on election integrity issues. And I spent 14 years there trying to fight the left's effort to stop them, to control the country, to take over elections at the local level. And after many years, I ended up being one of the lead Republican lawyers negotiating a bipartisan election reform bill in 2001. And the Republicans were about to agree to a Democratic proposal that would have been a partial federal takeover of elections. And I went to the Speaker's office and I said, we can't do this, we're Republicans. And what I heard from one of the Speaker's top political people was, look, we got to take care of the voting machine companies because they give to Republicans. We got to take care of the civil rights groups because they give to Democrats. The states don't matter. And I thought, holy cow. I met the enemy, and it's a lot closer than I thought. And so I started thinking from that point on, what do we do? How do we reverse this concentration of power that has been going on for so many years? How do we reverse it? And I ended up meeting a guy named Ed Meese, who was Reagan's Attorney General. And that's when we formed the Madison Coalition. And one of our first efforts was an effort to curb the authority of federal regulators. And we were working on that, and then we saw this threat of Supreme Court packing. But I want you to think about the rhetoric that you hear from politicians. Most of the time, they are telling you what they are going to do with their power. And I'm here to talk about court packing and how to stop it, but I want you to remember, if you remember one thing that I said today, I want you to remember 5 words. Take power out of Washington. And I started asking politicians, and I encourage you to do the same, what is your strategy for taking power away from Washington and giving it back to the states and the people where it belongs? And I don't know how many of you remember President Trump's inaugural speech in 2017, but the first words, almost the first words of his speech were, I'm here to take power out of Washington and give it back to you, the people. And the problem was the left understood the threat, and so they distracted him with everything they could throw at him, the kitchen sink, the house, the neighborhood, everything they could because they didn't want him to focus on that issue. And he was not able to focus on it in his first term. I hope he will in his second term. But if you will all think with me for a minute, how do we take power away from politicians and bureaucrats in Washington? And let me give you some food for thought. You don't do it by firing federal employees because the next administration can hire them back. You don't do it by repealing federal regulations because the next administration will put them back. You don't do it by abolishing cabinet departments because the next administration will put them back. Those are just using power. What we have to do is take away the power. So, for example, with regulations, you don't just repeal a regulation, you take away the power of the bureaucrats to issue regulations, right? You don't just abolish a department or fire employees, you take away the authority of Congress to borrow money so that they can fund all of this baloney, right? If you take that power away, then they can't do it. And so, with Ed Meese and others, we started thinking, what is a strategy for taking power out of Washington? Well, you can't do it by issuing executive orders. You can't even do it by passing laws or appointing judges, because those are all cyclical. They'll go back and forth. And I want to ask you a question. I was asking this yesterday at OCPAC in Oklahoma City. Does anybody know how many times in the last 100 years the left has won a supermajority in Washington? Control of Congress, control of the Senate, by a vote big enough to override a filibuster and control the White House. How many times in the last 100 years? Anybody know? Anybody want to guess? Who said? The answer is 4 times. About every 15 years they win a little majority, a temporary majority, trifecta. But 4 times in the last 100 years. 1912, Republican Party split, Taft, Roosevelt. What did we get? The income tax and the 17th Amendment, which took away the power of states to pick senators. Next time, economic crisis. Next time, 1964, Republican Party split again, Goldwater, Rockefeller. What did we get? Great Society, destroyed the American family. And we got Medicare, again, no way to pay for it, looming bankruptcy. Next time, 4th time, in your memory, Obamacare. The Obama victory, why? We had an economic crisis, sound familiar? And we got Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, which is basically a partial government takeover of the banking industry. So 4 times in the last 100 years. How many people believe there will never be a 5th time? No, it's gonna happen. It happens periodically. And it's like if you live on the beach in Florida, you know that there's gonna be a hurricane someday. The only question is how long. So if you don't build your house on stilts and build a seawall, you're cooked. If you live in Oklahoma, you know someday it might be a tornado, right? So you better have a tornado shelter, tornado plan. If you don't, it's your fault. So we know the left is headed for another majority sooner or later. We can win 1 election, 2 elections, 3 elections. We can't win 10 elections in a row. We never have. So that's our challenge. And the politicians won't tell you that. They'll say, well, just elect me and I'll solve all the problems. Well, they can't, because they can't promise to win every election. Now, I have another question for you. How many times in the last 100 years have Republicans won a supermajority so they could do anything they wanted to? Anybody know? 0. Never. Never. So when a Republican politician tells you, I'm going to pass a law without any Democrats that does X, Y, or Z, you might say, look, you can sell me the ticket to the moon or maybe even a ticket to Mars, but don't promise me that you can pass a piece of legislation that fundamentally shrinks the size of government. We've never been able to do it. So how have we? Have we had any successes in the last 100 years? And I want to ask again, can any of you think of a constitutional limit that we have been able to place on the power of politicians in Washington in the last 100 years? Anybody think of one? See, this is what's wrong with our education process. Nobody knows. Presidential term limits in 1951. Now, the 10th Amendment, right. The 10th Amendment is a great set of words, but it's so vague that only the courts can interpret it, which is why control of the Supreme Court is so important. But you're right. But there are 2 amendments in the last 100 years. One is presidential term limits. The other is repeal of prohibition. So we have succeeded in doing it, but not in the memory of anybody here. I mean, I was born in 1949. I don't remember presidential term limits. I wasn't reading back then. So we have to rediscover the art of mobilizing the country. And how do you do that? Well, anybody remember the Patriot Act? The Patriot Act, almost no politicians would vote against the Patriot Act because everybody knew what it was and they didn't know exactly what was in it, but they knew you had to vote for it. Well, I'm not a big fan of the Patriot Act. I think it's too much government intrusion. But the point is, it became universally known and politicians decided they had to vote for it. So if we want to do change, if we want to actually take power away from politicians and give it back to the people, we've got to have a strategy for doing it. And I believe the strategy is the strategy that has worked 27 times in the past, which is you get a simple amendment and you put together public pressure and you force Congress to propose it and you force the states to ratify it. People say, that's never happened, very difficult, it won't happen in recent memory. But if you think about the last recent memory, women's right to vote, the enactment of prohibition, the repeal of prohibition, presidential term limits, and the 18-year-old vote. Those 5 amendments within our memory all happened because they were very simple, they became overwhelmingly popular, widely known, and politicians were forced to vote for them. So how could we, as grassroots citizens, actually do that again? And I think there are 3 areas where we could mobilize the American public and actually take power away from Washington. I'll tell you how that relates to what you can do individually. I think the most important one maybe, but it's the longest range, is we've got to stop, we've got to take away the authority of politicians to borrow money. We've seen some kind of balanced budget amendment like Reagan originally proposed. It's going to be very difficult building a consensus. It's a long-range project. The second most important one is, as I mentioned before, we've got to curb the authority of federal regulators. The left campaigns as the party of democracy, but they are actually the party of bureaucracy. And we have to say, look, there's a huge difference between our team that believes that elected officials make the rules and their team that thinks that unelected bureaucrats impose the rules by decree. And if we can make that a difference between our team and their team, we have an issue that could drive both majorities around the country and eventually a constitutional amendment. So in that case, I've worked with Ed Meese and people around the country, and there is an amendment that you've never heard about. It's called the Regulation Freedom Amendment. It's in the 2016 Republican platform. It was endorsed by the Republican National Committee. It has been endorsed by 29 state legislative chambers, passing resolutions all over the country. Ted Cruz was the first senator to support it. Mike Pence was the first governor to support it. I don't hear Mike talking about it on the stage, unfortunately. And all it says is that major new federal regulations have to be approved by Congress. And what's a major regulation? Well, it's one that's objected to by a majority of the minority party in either the House or the Senate, which mathematically is always a quarter of the House or the Senate. So we have a policy, but politicians aren't talking about it. And the good news is that Mark Wayne Mullen was one of the first politicians in Washington to endorse it, but he hasn't been talking about it. So I would encourage you next week when he comes to say, Mark Wayne, hey, I heard you were a supporter of this amendment to require, constitutional amendment to require that regulations be approved by Congress. Will you talk about it some more? Because when in Washington, here's how bad Washington is. In Washington, they always talk about a law. They have this law called the REINS Act, which would require regulations that cost more than $100 million, according to some bureaucrat's estimate, to be approved by Congress. But think about it. If I sold you an umbrella that would melt when it rained, would you buy it? No. Well, the REINS Act is a law, so that even if we got it passed, and it's 50 pages long, so it's too complicated for the average voter to understand. If we passed a law, the next time the left had a majority, they'd repeal it. That's why we need a constitutional amendment. And we need more politicians in Washington talk about permanently taking away the authority of bureaucrats to rule by decree. So, fiscal discipline, curbing the bureaucrats, important issues. But now I'm here to talk to you about the mortal threat to our existence as a republic. And that is the left's goal of packing the Supreme Court. If they pack the court, all bets are off. They can rig the election rules, so we never win another election. They can impose a wealth tax, which right now the court would rule unconstitutional, so they can basically, instead of just taxing your income, they can tax everything you have. You have expensive property, they'll just take 2%, 5%, whatever they want, and you have to pay it. You don't have the money, you have to sell your property. Right? They can basically unleash the regulators, and it's not the regulations they enact that are most dangerous, it's the ones they threaten behind the scenes. You're a businessman, you're a nonprofit, you're an individual, you're fighting back against the left. Some guy comes to you and says, you know, they're thinking about a regulation that's going to put you out of business, so you better pipe down. Well, you can't stop that regulation. So it's the threat of regulations. Tyrants rule by fear. And the regulatory state terrifies everyone. That's one of the reasons Wall Street has gone woke, because they're terrified of being regulated out of business. So the only check we have right now is an independent Supreme Court. And that's why the left hates an independent Supreme Court. Every major interest group in the Democratic Party on the left wants a packed Supreme Court. The abortion industry, the people who want to crush religious freedom, the LGBTQXYZ coalition, all of these groups, the people who want to take away our Second Amendment rights, the people who want to crush the fossil fuel industry, the civil rights groups that want quotas, and to rig the redistricting rules around the country, the anti-free speech crew that wants the social media people and the big tech companies to crush conservative free speech. All of those people need a progressive Supreme Court to support the authority of the government to do the things they want. So here's what's going to happen. If we don't get an amendment to ban court packing before the left gets their next majority, and by that I mean as few as 50 votes in the Senate, which they could do in 2025, they're going to get rid of the filibuster or make an exception to it for civil rights issues. They're going to admit D.C. and maybe Puerto Rico as new states, and with those votes, they're going to pack the court. And the bad news is it's going to happen. Maybe not in 25 or 27 or 29, but sometime the next time the next wins another election. So just like Noah had to build the ark so that we could all be here, we have got to pass a constitutional amendment to ban court packing before the left packs the court. So let me tell you about the KeepNine Amendment. The KeepNine Amendment was first introduced in Congress by a Democrat, Colin Peterson from Minnesota. All it says is the Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices. Now, those may be the most 13 most important words that we put in the Constitution in the last 200 years, since the founding. So I want you to repeat after me. The Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices. Let's try it again a little more. The Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices. Now, one last time all together. The Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices. All right, 3 times, now you remember it. So, next time you meet somebody running for office, you say, tell me, do you support the KeepNine Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says the Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices? And watch what they say. And if they haven't heard of it, say, well, let me tell you about it. So let me tell you about the amendment. It was first introduced in Congress by a Democrat. It is now backed by more than 200 members of Congress, but there's still a few to go. And some who supported in the last Congress haven't supported it again, so we got to work on those guys. More than 800 state legislators around the country have passed it. It's been endorsed by 19 state legislative chambers, not yet in Oklahoma, so we need Oklahoma state legislators. There are a handful of governors who support it, but Kevin Stitt has not signed up, and we'd like Kevin to be a leader in this movement because an independent Supreme Court protects states from the federal government. So every governor, every attorney general ought to be a supporter. And so when you tell people about an amendment, people say, well, it'll never happen. How do you get 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states? And that's why the example of women's right to vote and presidential term limits and other amendments is so important. Because if we can make this amendment a household word in America, polls show that by a 2-to-1 margin, by more than a 2-to-1 margin, voters will support it. So we have, if we do this right, we have the potential to actually make this amendment a household word and mobilize the public to force Congress to make it happen. And so how does this relate to the 2024 elections? Because that's what we care about. That's one, we cannot do this if we lose the 2024 elections. So, as I've suggested, packing the court is the left's most dangerous power grab. But it is also their most unpopular major policy initiative. So it is also their biggest lie. If you ask Democrats, they'll say, oh, no, I'm not interested in packing the court, because they know they would lose elections. Every major Democrat in 2022 running for the Senate in a close race said, I'm against court packing. So how do we expose them? We expose them by saying, oh, I'm so glad you're opposed to court packing. Will you support the amendment first introduced in Congress by a Democrat to make sure it never happens? And what we'll get is gibberish, because Pelosi and Schumer will not let their members, their messages, you can say anything you want about court packing, but you cannot support the amendment to ban it because that would interfere with our plans. So we have to make this a household word and then force Democrats to tell us where they stand. The problem is, if there's some Republicans who won't support it, Democrats can say, well, just like this guy, I don't support it. So we've got to get every single Republican on board before we can expose the Democrats. But if we expose the Democrats, there are voters who might not be on our side if we talk about immigration or abortion or religious freedom or guns or regulations. But they might be on our side because they do not want the Democrats to destroy the Constitution, because they believe in fairness, they believe in independent courts. Example, if you were going to go to the Super Bowl and suddenly you read in the paper that the other side had bought off all of the referees at the Super Bowl, would you go to the game? No. So the same thing. People kind of get that the courts have to be independent from politicians if we're going to have the rule of law and a fair system. So we have the public on our side if we can make this an issue. But the left doesn't want to talk about it, so we have to talk about it. So I'm here in Tulsa because you have power. We know that court packing is dangerous. We know it's got to be stopped. We know that court packing could be one of the decisive issues in 2024. But we have got to act to make it happen. And my message to you is that each one of you can play a very powerful role. You may not understand how central Tulsa is to the politics of our nation. One of the most powerful members of the House of Representatives, Kevin Hern, is Tulsa's representative in Congress. If he decided, and he's for this amendment, but if he decided that he would be a leader and he would encourage the other members of his organization to start talking about it, he could have a transformational effect. And you saw Mark Wayne Mullen say, we got to stop the communists. Well, if Mark Wayne Mullen and Langford started talking about this amendment in the Senate and going and giving in speeches and saying, if you're pro-life, you've got to be for the KeepNine Amendment. If you're for the Second Amendment, you've got to be for the KeepNine Amendment. If you want to save America's energy industry, you've got to be for the KeepNine Amendment. You want honest elections, you've got to be for the KeepNine Amendment. If those politicians who you can vote for and who will listen to you begin to talk about it, they can inspire other politicians around the country to do it. And I think this revolution for taking America back from the political class in Washington, I think a lot of it starts right here in Oklahoma and right here in Tulsa because of you. So what am I asking you to do, right? Right? What I'd really like to ask you to do is take out your wallets and give me all your money, right? But that's what politicians do. So I'm not going to do that, right? Although if any of you have money, I'd love to talk to you about it. But that's not your power. That's not your power. We ask people to do three things. One, ask the politicians who are asking for your vote and asking for your time and asking for your money, where do you stand on this and will you talk about it? Will you tell your constituents? Will you talk about this on the media? Will you give speeches? Will you help alert Americans to the greatest danger that faces our republic today? Will you talk about the KeepNine Amendment? Number one. Number two, in the ways that you are comfortable with, help to spread the word about this amendment. We live in an incredibly connected world. You can call a talk show host, you can write a letter to the editor, you can post on social media, you can Google Supreme Court every day and post articles on the media. You can talk to your friends, you can go to meetings, you can say, I heard this crazy guy talk about court packing threat and the KeepNine amendment. Would you like to hear more information about it? And then forward information that you get from me to them. And then, most important, find a friend who will help you, who will do the same thing. If each one of you went out and found a friend and said, you know, we're about to lose our constitutional republic, and one of the things we have to do to save it is this amendment, you can have an enormous impact. And I'm looking for people, maybe there's somebody in this room who's retired, who's thinking, I want to spend my time, I want to spend my time doing some work that will actually have an impact, right? Republicans are going to carry all the big races in Oklahoma. I want to do something nationally that has an impact. If you would like to spend some time helping us to build a national network, please reach out to me. You can always reach out to me. My website is www.keepnine.org. You can email me at leaders@keepnine.org. But my closing message to you is, look, we've been taught that electing leaders is the most important thing we do, but it's not. The most important thing we can do is getting our leaders, the people we elect, to do what we want them to do. And right now, the thing we need our leaders to do is to take power away from politicians and bureaucrats and give it back to us. And the most important power we need to take away from those politicians is the power to manipulate the size of the Supreme Court. So I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for being patriots. And remember, leaders at KeepNine, leave your business card, come and talk to me, be part of this movement to save America. Thank you.